All right, so week 7. My primary focus this week was on finishing slash polishing slash testing the bird avatar. The first thing that I did is I went in and I added that falling animation that I talked about last week. I needed to go, because obviously I needed to go in and tell the player, hey, you're falling, that's why you're taking damage, add that extra little bit of sauce in for the bird avatar, right? This took longer than I anticipated it to add in, because, and this is getting a little bit technical, but the parent node to the avatar node that has the unique characteristics of the bird is the thing doing the actual animation. The bird node doesn't even know animation exists, right? At least by default, I have to add that behavior in. So when I added in the fall animation, the parent node was overriding it when you moved in a certain direction. So I had to add in a lot of special casing to the bird avatar node so that that didn't happen, right? Because I couldn't go into the parent node and add it because the rabbit relies on the parent node being the way it is. But after that little bit of a kerfluffle, I went in and fixed it, and it works fine. I like the way it looks. I think there's still a little bug where if you press the root note while you're flying, the bird will just go back to the ground. And that's not okay. And there was also a lot of bugs with the bird jumping into the air to fly, right? They could do this if you weren't pressing a directional. You just press the flight key and then the root note. It would just teleport up into the air, and it wouldn't play any of the flying animation. It would just pop, you're in the air now, and it could do that, and it was really silly. So I went in and I fixed that, so that doesn't happen anymore. That was pretty much it for the flight ability. Oh, no, one more thing. I had an idea. I guess this isn't a flight ability, so maybe not one more thing. I had the idea that maybe the bird could throw enemies into the air. I think I talked about this briefly last week. So I figured, okay, I don't know if it might be fun to play, so I'll make a bare bones version of it and then test that to see if it's fun. So I went in and I built a very basic enemy throwing system. The way that works, it's code that runs for every enemy. So if you're an enemy, it's going to run this code. It's in the general enemy class, to be a little bit more technical with it. And when the player presses the throwing by pressing the flight key and then the root note, every enemy in a certain radius of them takes on a status effect, quote unquote. It's not, I haven't actually coded in status effects, but that's something to do for next week. But basically, it takes on the state that it's thrown into the air and inverted, and then a little shadow appears below them, and they can't move while they're like this, and they're in the flight layer. It was alright. I don't like at least I didn't, because I'm going to change it. But I didn't like the filler art for what throws them into the air, and they just kind of teleport up in there, but that was okay, because remember, we're not trying to make something that's polished when we make this. We're trying to make something that's playable and can be tested. So after that, I actually showed the game to two of my friends, my sibling and then one of my best friends, and they gave the approval. They liked throwing the enemies into the air, and they thought it was fun to play, so it was sticking in the game, and I could go in and add more stuff to it. And to that end, I figured, okay, the first thing that I needed to fix were discrepancies, that long fancy word, in the ability. So not all enemies would move the same distance up into the air from the ability. This happened because the nodes for the enemies were sometimes scaled, so the enemy was the proper size for the game. So like the tarantula is actually scaled to half size what it is normally, because when I made the artwork for it, I accidentally made it too large, so I just scaled the node down by 1/2. Well, the downside of that is that the distance you move the sprite upwards actually gets halved, because the node is halved, right? So this was a really simple fix. I just divided the distance and the scale, the distance by the scale of the node in question, and then they moved up properly like they were supposed to, and that makes sense. Yeah, you're undoing the scaling. The other thing that I did is the enemies are just kind of floating in the air, right? You just press the button, and you press the other button, and then bam, they're floating. It was bad. Like, it didn't look very okay, and it was okay for the skeleton, but it's not going to be okay if I want the game to be polished, and when the avatars are something that needs to be polished, because you're going to spend so much time using these player characters. So to fix that, I thought, okay, how can the bird's wings sort of be throwing these enemies into the air? And I figured, what if there's like a tornado or like an updraft from the wing flaps? So I went in and I made an updraft particle effect. And I actually really like this effect. I decided to use a Godot shader instead of the traditional Godot particle materials that I use for the rest of the game to get a more custom effect. And I actually really like the result that I did. I ended up using, because a tornado really, in 2 dimensions, when you draw it, you have lots of oscillating motions, right? So it maps very naturally to a sine wave. So what I did is I used a sine wave and then sort of pinched it when it got near the origin, and then had the particles travel that path. That coupled with some modulus math to get them going up in pairs. and I had a decent looking tornado. I like the way it looks a lot. I'm not sure if I want to have the individual dust particles of the tornado themselves rotating as it goes upwards. Because honestly, I think it looks okay straight, but I might have it rotate just because the push particles of the bird also rotate when you push stuff. And I might want to, obviously be consistent with the type of particle I'm using. But yeah, for the most part, I like it, and it looks really nice. The other issue with the throw ability, or the flight ability that would throw enemies into the air, was that the generalized enemy code didn't necessarily work for every enemy, because there were some special cases. So for example, with corruptible enemies, well, let me back up. The flight code, the way it works, it throws the enemy from the layer they're in and then just shifts it up to the flight layer. So it says, whatever you're at now, you're that but flying. The issue is the default layer that it throws upwards for corruptible enemies is nothing, because corruptible enemies start out as non-colliders. They don't collide with anything, right? The carrots that are in the ground don't collide with the player, and they shouldn't. It'd be bad if they did. But the side effect of that is that when these corruptible carrots turned into enemies and were thrown into the air by the bird's throw ability, they wouldn't actually be a flying layer. Because it would set them to the default layer, which means they're not going to collide with anything, but they're still going to be flying there. And this had the comical result of the carrot not flying, but still being able to move upside down and chase you. So you would be chased by this giant upside down, well, I guess it's not giant, you'd be chased by this upside down corrupt carrot in the air who would still be able to damage you while you were on the ground. And obviously this is not good. We don't want that to happen. So I went in and wrote some special case for corruptible enemies codes. It still takes the parent code, but it sort of wraps it so that it goes on the layer that it's supposed to go on. And that works fine. The corruptible enemies work okay, and I really like it. Yeah, so after that, well, actually, technically it was before that, but I went in and I figured it's time to implement the feather ability, the one that lets you shoot. To start this, I went in and I made the feather sprite in Inkscape, and I actually realized that I don't necessarily have to do animation for this feather because of how fast it's moving. You're not going to see the animation anyways. So I went in and I implemented the feather sprite. Once that was done, I used the same projectile class that I used for the push particles, like I thought I would, for the feather, and it actually sped up development quite a bit. I spent a little bit of time fiddling around with the general projectile class so I could make any projectile in the flight layer and flying. And this worked really well, so the feather can be on the ground or it can be flying, and it will only hit enemies in the flying layer. When it's flying, only enemies on the ground. I mean, it makes sense. I spent a little bit of time fiddling around with the rotation of sprites inside the projectile class, so that way sprites would just automatically rotate to the direction you shot them from the projectile. You wouldn't have to manually put in the code every time, and I think it's nice and it works okay. That was pretty much it, though. It's the gist of it. I'm thinking about next week going in and adding a spawn particle to the feather projectile, so like it looks like there's more plumage that shoots out, not necessarily damaging things, but like shoots outwards and like floats away when you shoot out the feather. There's obviously fixing the small bug where you press the root key and then fall out of the sky, because that's not gonna be a good thing. The animations have to be proper there too, and making the bunny statue a bird statue. Again, that's one of those things where like I know it's gonna be really short to do, it's not gonna take a lot of time, so I'm like, oh, I'll do it later. And then later becomes forever later, right? The other thing that I learned from the playtesting is that the blue sky that I've been using for the bunny zone actually looks a little bit like water. And I need to go in and figure out a solution to make it look more like a sky. Maybe add like floating islands in the background or like clouds or something, just so it doesn't look like static, boring water. I can maybe even add clouds. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, that's all for next week. And until then.